One of the fundamental principles of liberalism is a belief in progress, and that progress can be managed to make the world better, fairer, safer, healthier, and even more beautiful. These are ideas that are still very present in our own culture, and our assumption, for example, that our children's lives should be better than our own, that progress will continue, and it's our responsibility to manage that progress and to direct it. But in reality, the idea of progress was really a product of the Enlightenment. It's a relatively new concept in the Western imagination. It's a product of the Enlightenment and a product of secularism, as previously it was believed that perfection was only possible in the next world, and that the direction of progress was really part of the divine plan outside of our control. The medieval worldview was relatively static. Change was feared. Tradition and custom were the only protections common people enjoyed. We saw this when we saw the manorial economy, how conservative the peasantry was, because that was the only protection they had against their landlords. In a world that was stacked against them, doing things the same way provided them with some measure of protection. When there were rebellions, the rebellions were always defined as restorative. That is, returning to the good old ways, the right ways, the appropriate ways that had been abandoned in favor of novelty. Novelty, change, these were always seen as worse. Well, the Reformation, interestingly enough, strongly reinforced this. The Reformation was very much in the tradition of a return to what was seen as something that had been lost. Reformers argued that they were returning to the intentions of the founders of Christianity, to the apostolic church, shorn of accretions, or searching for a pure, remember the Puritans, religion. These were the ones who were looking for the basic texts. Look for the Bible. See what the New Testament says. Forget what popes and church councils said. We're going back to the way that it was and the way that it should be. It was the Enlightenment that changed this perception. The Enlightenment argued that men and women controlled their lives on earth and could improve these lives by applying the dictates of reason. The scientific revolution, with the discoveries of Galileo and Newton, made the forces of nature and the universe itself comprehensible. And if comprehensible, then subject to some measure of control, at least with respect to those areas where nature was not absolute. Superstition, a rational but accepted belief, such as the supremacy of noble birth, you have to obey the king because he's the king, and outright challenges to the divine and to the structure of the church were initiated in the name of reason. Anything could be challenged in the name of reason. The search for evidence then was everywhere. The application of reason in the 19th century was largely scientific. That is, the application of the scientific method that we've seen defined by René Descartes in the Discourse on Method, and then developed through empirical observation represented by Locke and Newton's laws to discover truth. Once the universal application of scientific method was implemented, it became the servant of this growing belief in progress, because now you had a tool, you had an instrument through which progress could be determined by looking at how science operated, how nature revealed itself. So then scientific method became not just the context of science, it became the context of almost every aspect of the human condition. What this means then is that change came not to be seen as dangerous, as a threat, but to represent progress, that is, positive change. And it was tangible. All you had to do was look about you to see the positive results of the Industrial Revolution. The 19th century was an amazing place to those who were living within it, and the change was so rapid and so visible and so universal that it could hardly be challenged. There was more wealth, more and cheaper goods, better and faster communications, more food, more clothing, more almost everything. It was possible then to lead a life that was not only rich and meaningful, but also to assume that that life was going to improve and the life of your children would improve. Moreover, in the political realm, governments were becoming more representative, that more and more people were being brought into the action of the state. There was a growing sense that all citizens, not just those with the most property, deserved to be part of the political process. It was now seen as necessary because the political process affected them. They simply did not live under laws that others made for them, but it was reasonable, that it was rational, that they actually participate in making those laws because they would be subject to them as well. This again was the application of reason and the application of evidence to complex situations. So change was everywhere. Change was everywhere, and although new problems were created, as we've seen, the general European consensus was that progress was occurring, even if the goals of progress were defined differently by different groups. We've seen hostility to progress in many ways. We've seen the Luddites breaking machinery to protest the rise of factories and the end of the putting out system and the domestic textile manufacturing. Or the saboteurs sacrificing their wooden shoes. We've seen, and we will see again, conservatives fighting political, social, and economic change, fighting the rise of liberalism, trying to hold on to their own particular set of privileges at the expense of others. But by 1850, to everyone in Europe, especially if among the middle classes, progress appeared to be unassailable, proved by the catalog of the positive benefits of this dynamic age. The evidence was overwhelming. And remember, we're dealing in a world of scientific method where evidence was everything. We're dealing in an empirical world where you simply had to look about you. The idea of progress and the connection between progress and science, then, was something that was not only visceral and obvious and depended upon a long tradition that stretched back to the scientific revolution, but also became carefully defined and, in fact, developed in ideas that began to define the 19th century perspective on change. In particular, there was advanced in the writings of a Frenchman named Auguste Comte a set of principles which would put change and put the idea of progress into a broader context that would turn it almost into a philosophical system and provide some of the mechanisms, some of the vocabulary for how to investigate change, how to measure change, how to direct change. And this, of course, would prove to be a major contribution, but also something of a threat to the society that then assumed it. Auguste Comte was a Frenchman. Born after the turmoil of the French Revolution, he was born in 1795, had ended, but still he was influenced by the Enlightenment. Kant sought to establish a comprehensive philosophical system that would encompass all human knowledge. And he believed that the beginning of the 19th century represented the start of the final age in history. He too was just amazed by the progress made by humanity, and he saw reason and rationalism and the Enlightenment in general guiding men forwards towards ever greater prosperity, towards universal peace, and towards happiness. He described these events in a philosophy which he entitled positivism. Kant believed that all knowledge passed through three stages. The first was theological, that is, a revealed religion that was interpreted by a set of priests. The second was metaphysical, that is, abstract, the discussion of abstract principles by the discipline of a new form of intellectual priests. And the third, positive or scientific. This is the last stage of history, the scientific, and this was the 19th century. His scientific age, this 19th century, was the age in which science would allow mankind to understand nature without having to return to more primitive stages. Because even in the metaphysical system, there had to be people who could interpret the complexities of these ideas and have to do so through a system that wasn't based upon the dictates of reason and clear evidence, but rather upon interpretation and the subjective. Science had already solved so many problems. Science clearly could now be used to reorder society and solve the rest of them, to bring an end to the intellectual anarchy that caused wars, upheaval, social dislocation. Kant saw this new science, this new comprehensive, overarching set of ideas that would ultimately bring into focus this way of managing change. He called it sociology, a discipline that considers Kant to be one of its founders. Kant believed that political institutions, social structures, and ideas were all interdependent. So when they were sufficiently studied and understood, when you had enough evidence, when you had enough material, a blueprint could be drawn up for society to follow a guide. In other words, you would have a guide to progress. You would have a map a blueprint that would allow progress to be institutionalized and structured. Once a particular problem or institution was studied, data would have to be gathered, conclusions drawn from these data, and then reforms could be devised to deal with the problem. What we see is a connection here. If we think of the Enlightenment and we think of the Encyclopedia of Diderot, Diderot said he was editing this enormous set of volumes, this collection of all known facts, in order to allow people to make proper, correct judgments based upon evidence that was seen as true after having been evaluated. This essentially is what Kant is saying as well, that in fact, in order to direct progress, you have to have correct information. So you have to study society itself, and you have to have the material available so that you have got the evidence that will allow decisions to be correctly informed. It was very much dependent upon the ideas of Diderot, but it was also heavily dependent upon the role of science and empirical knowledge that Kant simply saw as the driving force of his own 19th century world. It also, in fact, can be seen as an element of social engineering. We're going to come back to a discussion of social engineering and see it in some of its more horrific manifestations in the 20th century. But nevertheless, we have to remember that social engineering also has a very long tradition in Europe. More's utopia that we discussed some time ago is really social engineering. You create a society where virtue and goodness can operate, and where sin and temptation can be reduced by the structure of society itself, and this ultimately will change the nature of the people living within that society. We saw it in Montesquieu, in De l'Esprit des Lois, that 18th century wonderful blueprint for a rationalist society. Montesquieu says the same. He said that the Constitution has an effect on the people who live underneath its laws. Those people who are subject to those laws, who live within that Constitution, will be changed by the nature of those laws and the structure of society itself. In other words, people who live under a set of obligations and in a particular kind of social structure will be influenced by, and their personalities, their natures, individually and collectively, can be changed. This, of course, was seen by Auguste Comte as a good thing, because good men would choose good evidence to produce good results. Of course, we'll see later in the 20th century, it also gave rise to Lenin's attempt to create the new socialist man and the fascist attempt to create the new fascist man, elements of social engineering that perhaps are best forgotten. Well, we can see how these ideas resulted from the Enlightenment application of Newtonian physics to the human condition. As Newton pointed out in terms of the universe, but more importantly, what his social observers, those empirical thinkers who wanted to take the model of science and apply to society revealed, is that to know what is immutable and why is to define what is changeable by human action. In other words, to know what is determined by natural law and therefore cannot be changed is to know what can be changed. In other words, falling under human or positive law. Hence positivism. Positivism is in fact that area that Kant identified together with so many other rationalist thinkers that would allow society to identify its own principles and its own goals and then create institutions and effect change in a way that would fulfill those goals. Kant's influence extended into all of the social sciences, and many pure sciences as well, in fact. But his theories were also applied to educational reform and politics in particular. John Stuart Mill embraced Kant's positivism, while Charles Darwin found great solace in Kant's belief in the progress of science, and also in his laws of organization that shaped the stages of social development. And of course, as a scientist, he liked the fact that history would end with science. Herbert Spencer, a supporter of Darwin, whom we'll meet in our discussion of social Darwinism, Spencer, the man who coined the term survival of the fittest, was also very heavily influenced by Auguste Comte. And he authored in 1873 The Study of Sociology, which took so many of these ideas developed by this Frenchman and then made them readily available to the English-speaking world, particularly in Britain and America. In both England and France, positivism was then primarily a middle-class movement. because it reflected the values of the educated bourgeoisie, those who had prospered from the Industrial Revolution and who wished to translate change into progressive action that would benefit society as a whole. It was a set of beliefs that belonged to the 19th century ideals of science, those things that we've seen already arising that had entered the Western consciousness, as I've said, through the encyclopedia, but also galvanized later, after the 18th century, into the 19th, that allowed the middle classes to search for ways to actualize these ideas. Also, Kant's love of numbers, his love of statistics, his love of quantitative evidence, permitted these middle-class reformers to provide empirical evidence, to provide scientific proof of where they were, how they were improving, and where they should go. It allowed them to track progress, to measure how much better Europe had become. Moreover, there was indeed evidence. And the evidence that the world was improving was in fact everywhere. And what's more, the evidence was less and less impressionistic and more concrete as the methods of Kant, the collecting of statistics, the collecting of numbers, revealed. Kant did not produce these ideas in a vacuum. He was very much influenced by the society around him, as all thinkers are. And the application of the empirical method provided solid proof that human welfare and the human condition were improving. Well, not just thinkers like Kant putting together philosophical principles that then became applied in the political and economic and social environments, but also others whose work indicated and who provided evidence that allowed change to be measured and seen, and in the instance especially of those working in medicine, felt in the most intimate of ways, how you feel that the health of your children, the expectation that you can overcome disease and sickness. So amongst the most significant of the improvements came from the fields of chemistry and medical science, in the work of men like Louis Pasteur in France and Robert Koch in Germany. These scientists, these remarkable men, aided by new technology, such as the microscope — in fact, neither could have done their work without the invention of the microscope — simultaneously identified bacteria as the cause of infection. This is, of course, one of the great and remarkable discoveries of the entire 19th century, because it not only provided a way to cure and, in fact, to prevent disease, it also overturned some of Europe's most widely held opinions and ideas and beliefs. Things that everybody accepted, like the spontaneous generation of disease, in fact, spontaneous generation altogether. And we all have our suspicions that leaving the banana in the sunlight and the heat too long spontaneously generates fruit flies. It seems to be the evidence. This is common sense. But of course, Pasteur and Koch proved that that is not the case. You can't see those little eggs, but they're there. It destroyed the belief in talismans and saints' relics for protections. There was no point in wearing garlic around your neck because it wasn't in fact going to cure you. It might keep you away from other people who were infected, but aside from that, it's not going to do much good. There's no point in making a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Lucy if you want to have your eyesight restored, despite the piles of eyeglasses in front of the altar, because it's not going to work. That has nothing to do with how science works. Curses. Why bother to curse someone when in fact the only thing that it does is make you feel a little bit better? Witches have no role, because if witches can't curse and cause disease, then what do? In other words, all of these superstitions and all of these things that generally were assumed not just from the beginning of recorded history, but also based upon a kind of basic intuition, a kind of common sense, were all evaporated by science. These ideas, of course, did not die easily, and they are still very much alive in some ways. When I was a student in Italy, the maid in the pensione where I lived would come into my room at night after I was asleep and close the French doors to my balcony. And eventually I asked her, "Maria, why do you do this?" And she said, Signore, l'aria di notte fa male, la miasma. The night air is bad. The miasma will make you ill. The night air itself, in fact, is evil, and it carries disease that will make you sick. Maria believed that in the 1970s, and it was part of the tradition that the science of the 19th century began to eradicate. Pasteur and Koch applied their discoveries to the prevention as well as the treatment of disease. This breakthrough greatly decreased mortality, simply by ensuring that cleanliness and the antiseptic environments necessary to ensure health were pursued not just in hospitals, but also in homes. As infectious diseases decreased, life expectancy grew. You could have greater hope that your children would live beyond the age of 5. You could realize that there was some hope in making sure they would not get infection simply by keeping the surfaces of your kitchen clean. And with the growth in life expectancy and with the availability of cheaper food, fertility and longevity both increased. The result of this was that the population of Europe more than doubled during the 19th century. The population increase in Europe then was largely driven by these scientific changes, by the sorts of things that we're talking about. Food was also safer, as Louis Pasteur's procedure for the pasteurization of milk improved the diets of Europeans dramatically and also led to a decrease in certain diseases such as tuberculosis. Pasteurized dairy products and beer, the pasteurization of beer permitted the creation of the huge national brewery industries of Europe that are very much still there and part of the culture of the continent. The pasteurization could now ensure that food could be moved across long distances, that the food would be kept fresh, making high-protein foods such as cheeses readily available at much lower costs, again, providing better nutrition for the poor, increasing their fertility, increasing their basic health, and ensuring that the population of Europe would continue to grow. Pasteur's work provided immediate benefits to all, not just those who wanted to ensure there was a clean space where food was prepared, but also those who believed that these sorts of scientific changes would in fact have an impact upon the civilization of Europe itself. These things were of immediate benefit to all Europeans, regardless of class. It had instilled the concept of science as the instrument of well-being and progress, just as Auguste Comte had observed. Comte said that the 19th century was this final age, and science was the harbinger of this age. Well, it seemed as though men like Pasteur and Koch had proved this to be true. This gave rise to the hygiene movement, which again had a downside. It's difficult to imagine, but in fact, what we'll see again in the 20th century, how this idea could be perverted. How the hygiene movement gave rise to eugenics, for example, that is, the selective breeding, to racial theory, and to the concepts of clean and unclean races and people. The adjective dirty, used as a term of racial or religious opprobrium, began to develop because these people then were put outside the instruments of progress, the vehicles that would change the world for the better. And we can see then that all of these elements, good as they were, reflecting true advances in the human condition, could also be perverted. And so when we see the rise of the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, fascism and communism, we will see elements that still reflect some of these principles being turned against the human condition and using a vocabulary that should do good to in fact do unspeakable evil. So progress was indeed visible everywhere. And industrialization had expanded the wealth of Europe, and liberal legislation had improved the conditions of the poor. However, this progress was often interpreted as competition among nations as well as among industries. And Comte's emphasis on quantitative evidence and statistics now provided an easy point of comparison among nations, one increasingly used in the 19th century and now used obsessively in our world, as is clear from the popular press and political rhetoric. The front page of USA Today with the statistics on whatever they choose to identify that day is in fact a direct result of Comtean collection of statistics where everything can be determined in comparison of numbers. And let's use this method for a moment to see why these statistics can be used either to reinforce a sense of self-confidence or to reinforce a sense of threat. In 1880, Great Britain produced more industrial machinery than any other country in the world. But by 1913, Britain had dropped to third place, behind Germany and the new giant, the United States. In 1880, German steel production was only half as much as their British counterparts. In 1900, they were producing 20% more. British textile production actually fell during those same years, while German production doubled. and iron production in Britain remained stagnant while German production doubled again. At sea, Britain faced growing competition from the German merchant fleet, and in the 1890s, the Germans began to build a deep-water navy to protect its seaborne trade. Although the British fleet was still larger than any two combined fleets of any two great powers on Earth, England, for the first time in that century, felt its naval supremacy to be challenged. On the other hand, Britain still controlled 21% of all the trade in the world. Almost a quarter of all trade on the face of the earth was controlled by Great Britain. Germany was next with about 12%. The United States, also building a formidable navy and merchant marine, about 11%, and France, about 8%. So these four countries controlled more than half of the trade on the face of the earth. It's not an accident that the 19th century was seen then as an age of empire, not only in terms of expansion of European power, but in terms of the economic control that Europe enjoyed over the rest of the world. The vast wealth created by this volume of trade was often returned in new investment. In other words, if you invest in trade, and especially if you're going to invest in imperial trade, you will get your returns back in large measure. For example, in the last quarter of the 19th century, British overseas investment increased by 300% because Britain itself had been largely capitalized. The industries were mature, and now you were looking for new sources, either of raw materials or new places to produce new goods. And so much of that 300% increase went to the British Empire, and you felt you were investing at home because the empire fell under British law, protected by the British fleet. So what I've done is used the examples of positivism. From these numbers, it should become clear why Britain was feeling particularly nervous about the rise of Germany, and the Germans feeling very confident that the future belonged to them. Because if you look at the trajectories, Britain was moving down, the Germans were moving up. So quantitative evidence and statistics are not free of emotional and political consequences. And this obsession with numbers helped lead to the environment that could, in fact, permit an event as horrible as the First World War to actually happen. By 1900, we can talk of a global economy of world markets rather than simply European markets. Decisions made by directors of companies in London, Berlin, or Paris affected thousands, tens of thousands of workers around the world, and thousands of shareholders. Before the 19th century, the only people who could even imagine such international power would be kings or popes. Now these things became the perks of the captains of industry, people who were not chosen by churches or by royal descent, people who were chosen in order to deliver a profit for their shareholders. Again, the principles of the world have changed. The reality was that the race for empire and industrial supremacy gave rise to optimism, to be sure. There was great optimism, but it was also tainted with fear and apprehension. Kant's emphasis on data, collecting information on industrial output, productivity, market share, and so on, gave European nations not only hope, but also fear as they compared the advantages of their economic, imperial, and strategic rivals to their own. The evidence of superiority or fear of falling behind had the effect of seeing other industrial powers as enemies in a dangerous zero-sum game. And it's this mentality of a zero-sum game in which the more the Germans gain, the more the British will lose, that really helped cause the environment that would allow the First World War to actually happen. The advent of Darwin and Darwinism, part of the cult of scientism of the 19th century, as we'll see, added to this fear, as entire nations, classes, or industries feared being selected out by stronger, swifter competitors. This element of social or economic Darwinism will be discussed later, but we must here note that the infectious and justified optimism of the 19th century in Europe held also the seeds of Armageddon, the First World War. There, the survival of the fittest would be tested on a scale previously unimaginable, and the entire continent would be, in fact, put into a cauldron of destruction. And we also have to attribute some of the environment that allowed this to happen to this obsession with numbers. Previously, it was impressionistic. You feared the Germans because it appeared they were getting stronger. but now you had the evidence to prove it. You were nervous about your own economic decline, but now you had the evidence to prove it. And there had to be a moment where you had to act, because if you declined too far, or if your enemy had improved too rapidly, you would be in a position where you could not win. So in this dangerous zero-sum game, as I've described it, we have the makings of that most terrible event, the thing that destroyed the structure of Europe in the 19th century, the First World War. And part of it was the result of a belief in science and progress, ironically.